Hey listeners, it's Ben from Young Care. Today we're going to talk about improving employment for Australians with disability. According to recent stats from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, the 4.4 million Australians with a disability are much less likely to be employed than Australians without disability. While 80% of working-age Australians without disability are employed, only half of working-aged Australians with disabilities are in jobs. But what does this mean when we're looking at the big picture? It means people with disability are more likely to be unemployed, underemployed, and working in poorer quality jobs than people without disability. Today, we're joined by Dr. Marissa Shields and Dr. Zoe Aitken from the Centre of Research Excellence in Disability and Health to talk about these disparities and a recent study they released that examines the mental health impact of employment among people with disability. Welcome to the show.
Are you sick of the same old disability stereotypes? We were too, so we did something about it. Welcome to That Was Unexpected, the Disability Left podcast for everyone. Brought to you by Young Care and hosted by me, Lisa Cox. Join our amazing guests as we delve into topics that don't often hit the headlines. So let's do this. Prepare for the unexpected. If you're low vision like me or have other accessibility requirements, check out our show notes. Before we get started, we'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of land on which we record. We pay respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging.
Zoe and Marissa, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for coming on. Now, this is part of our mini-series about disability employment, and you heard from some wonderful people recently with lived experience. And today we're taking a different tact, talking to some people who are researching in that area. And research is so important in this space because it informs public policy, government policy, all those sorts of things. But Zoe and Marissa, can you tell us, before we get into the research that you've done, which is awesome, I've read the articles, read the papers, below it, can you tell us a little bit about yourselves, your backgrounds and those sorts of things?
Yeah, sure. Well, for starters, I just want to say thanks for having us on. I know Zoe and I have done a lot of research on employment and mental health over the past few years, and it's really great to get an opportunity to actually talk about it. So I got into research while I was finishing my Master of Public Health. I decided I wanted to have a bit of a career change, so went to do a master's.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed some of my courses that I was taking and found myself interested in how these sort of environments that we work and live in, how they can shape our health outcomes. And so I was really lucky and able to get a small research assistant job, actually working with Zoe and people who are still in our research group, and ended up finding a bit of a passion with employment. And so, that was such a great experience that I've just kind of stayed on at the uni since then.
It's really cool. And what about you, Zoe?
I fell into this area a bit by accident, a very fortuitous accident. I've always been interested in issues about social justice, but disability epidemiology or disability research wasn't really a focus of my public health training. So I didn't really have much awareness that there was a whole research area dedicated to this. But I was offered a job at just the right time, working with a team that I really respected. So I jumped in and quickly discovered an area I was really passionate about. I think it was the realization of very stark inequalities in health outcomes and also in employment, but also a lack of research in this area and a lack of narrative generally about this area. And it made me realize here was an area there was potential to really do the sorts of research that makes a real impact, a real difference to people's lives, which is the reason we're driven to do the work that we do.
Yeah, and I think it's so great that you both are, because there's a lot of little rabbit holes to go down in the disability employment space, but having that research is so key to be able to take to stakeholders and things like that. And just to let our listeners know that this incredible research study, which we'll chat a bit now, it is co-designed, has people with disabilities included in the study. So it's not just what the subject sitting in the corner being asked questions through a glass booth. This is led and driven by people with disabilities as well, which is so important and something I love to see. But this research, please tell us more about it and what you've uncovered, because it's all about, just a quick overview, the link between disability employment or underemployment and mental health, which so many of our listeners will be a no-brainer. Like, yeah, of course. But now we have some qualitative and quantitative data to put to that. So guys, can you please tell us about the research?
Yeah, so like Zoe said, we are really fortunate that we work with a really great team of people. And like you mentioned, with people with disabilities, so they can help inform what we're doing, make sure we're asking the right questions, looking at the right things, and actually generating results that are important. So this body of research was really looking across the employment cycle and sort of what those experiences looked like and how they impacted people with disabilities' mental health. And then that would help us think through, okay, where are we kind of running into barriers? Where are people experiencing problems? And what could we actually do to then fix that? So with this sort of employment cycle type approach, we looked at when people were looking for work, what kind of experiences they might encounter. So maybe that's discrimination, not finding many jobs that are out there or jobs that meet their needs. Then we looked, okay, when people are successfully in a job, what does that look like? And that's, like you said, when we found that experiences of underemployment were really common. The jobs might be of good quality. And unfortunately, we found that workplace discrimination was really prevalent. And then that in turn took us to kind of that last stage of employment where maybe you actually leave your job. So maybe your job isn't a good fit for you and it doesn't work out. You end up leaving it and either looking for a new job, starting all over again, or potentially going, you know what, this is really not working out for me, and kind of leaving the labor force altogether. So we looked at that sort of holistic experience and how people's personal characteristics and the environment around them shape those experiences and how their mental health might be impacted by that.
Perhaps I could just add a little bit of context about this report. So it's not just one piece of work. What Marissa and I did was summarised lots of different pieces of work done by our team within a big program of research that we were doing as a team across multiple universities. So we summarised lots of different pieces of research that we'd done, and that included studies that use quantitative methods, so using data, whether it was existing data sets or data that was collected by the team to produce statistics, and that's sort of the work that Marissa and I both tend to focus on. But we had people within the team who do qualitative research, where they do interviews or focus groups, asking people about their experiences and really in-depth perspectives. We also did some reviews where we summarised evidence relating to a particular topic to try and understand perhaps how lots of small studies, what we can deduce from small studies and what the best quality evidence might be when we take all of that into account. And as we've talked about briefly alongside this, in all our work, we engage with people with lived experience of disability, and we do that in different ways. We have some lived experience research assistants within the team who are employed because they are experts by experience. But we also have many academic team members with lived experience of disability. And then there are some projects where we work with advisory groups or community groups to understand broader perspectives. So these are all different ways that we bring lived experience perspectives into our research.
Okay, now the quantitative data that you mentioned, have you got any stats that you could throw at us really, really quickly?
And then we've got some very simple statistics about employment.
Great.
So, for example, about 50% of people with disability of working age are employed, and this compares to about 80% of people without disability. About 10% of people with disability are unemployed, and this compares to about 4% of people without disability. So there are some sort of key statistics demonstrating those stark inequalities in employment.
I was just going to add, with all of what Zoe said, that's what we're seeing now, but it's also what we've been seeing for a long time. Those numbers are really quite stagnant. They haven't changed over the last, say, 20 years. We've still seen these really big inequalities in employment.
Despite all the money that's being spent on programs, but we'll get into that just a little bit later. In reading the article about your research, something I found really interesting was that your findings showed that people who were employed part-time had better health outcomes than people who were not employed at all. So could you delve into that a little bit more?
Yeah, I can start perhaps with that. So we looked at part-time work and underemployment in slightly different ways, and Marissa might highlight some of the work about unemployment afterwards. But when we looked at people who were working part-time, we found that people who were working part-time, it actually had positive impacts on mental health if they were choosing to work part-time and didn't want to work more hours. We found this research project combined quantitative data for looking at statistics, but also qualitative interviews with people with disability and other stakeholders. We found that part-time work was beneficial for mental health and associated with reduced use of mental health services. And when we spoke to people about their experiences, we found that some people saw part-time work as a transition into full-time employment, so a pathway into work. But other people were working part-time because they didn't have the capacity to work full-time. And I think the findings of that research really highlights the need for flexibility in work so that people with disability can find a job that meets their needs.
Right. And we all saw a lot of, whether or not you have a disability, there was a lot of flexibility and a lot of changes during COVID. What do you think we learned during COVID about the importance of flexibility and disability employment? I know there was a paper that I read only recently about employment rates for people with disabilities going up during COVID because suddenly we could all work from home and there was that flexibility, which we'd been asking for decades. But businesses always said, oh, no, we can't do that. The business can't afford to, or whatever their excuse was. And suddenly the pandemic meant we have to. And disability employment rose, as terrible as COVID was. So could either of you speak, was that included in our research at all? Could you speak to that?
So that wasn't something that I would say we generally looked at in our research. And part of that, I think, is because much of this research started before COVID and a lot of it was wrapping up during COVID. So we didn't necessarily have the data to really delve into that point. And I think we're still kind of exploring what those effects look like in these years post the really acute part of the pandemic. I think we know anecdotally and from some research that we've done that working from home was a real benefit for people with disabilities. And I would also add that it's a benefit for lots of different kinds of people, right? So people who have caring responsibilities, for whatever reason, you're juggling your life and working from home and having that flexibility is beneficial for a lot of people. So I would say working from home definitely, and having those different kinds of technologies that can allow people to participate is really beneficial, but still something that we are learning more about and exploring. We do work with a lot of people with disabilities and we do work with people who are out of state. So having this ability to work from home and work remotely, I think has really made our research better because we can easily work with and chat with all different kinds of people who are in all different kinds of places and having lots of different experiences. So I can certainly say for our research, I think it's enriched it.
That's such an important point to make. For any research is looking to include people with disabilities, having this technology available, because you get a certain subset of the disability community who can maybe afford inner city living or all of those sorts of things. We don't have any sociologists on the show to chat to us in depth about that. But yeah, really good point. Now, underemployment, unfortunately, is something I've certainly experienced a lot of, and a lot of our listeners may have as well. Could one of you please explain underemployment and also what your research found in that area?
We definitely found that underemployment was a common experience and that it can really negatively impact people's mental health. But just to clarify what we actually mean by underemployment, because I know Zoe talked just before about part-time employment, and I think at a glance can seem like maybe they're the same thing. They can be easy to confuse. But when we're talking about underemployment, we're actually talking about a situation where a person is in a job, but they're not getting the amount of hours that they want. So they might want 20 hours a week, but they're only getting 15, or they want 40 hours a week. They want to be full-time, but they're only getting 30. So there's this mismatch between what people want and what they're getting. So what we found in our research is that for both people with and without disability, being underemployed has negative impacts on mental health. So it's not good for anybody. But the key thing we found was that this impact was much greater for people with disability. So they experience this kind of larger deterioration in their mental health when they're underemployed compared to people who don't have a disability. So it's really significantly damaging, we found.
And would it be correct to say that underemployment is also when you're doing roles which are well below your capability? I know that was my experience. I was brought into an office to answer phones and stuff envelopes. I was so bored, I had to leave. And the same thing happened in the next role. And that was my version of underemployment. Would that be correct?
That's definitely another form of underemployment. I think we might use different words to explain that experience because we're trying to parse it out and apply it within data and make statistics work for it.
Of course. So I'm just thinking of our listeners.
That form of underemployment is certainly something that people experience. And I think we've heard about that from people, certainly in our qualitative research as well. That's probably where it's more come out for us in this body of research. And we have some case studies in our reports, actually. I'm thinking of one in particular of a younger person who was successfully able to get a job and then found that the expectations were so low, she actually wasn't being given any proper work to do. And it was that kind of mismatch of she's got skills and she wants to work and wants to build on her abilities, and she just wasn't being provided with an opportunity to do that. So that's, unfortunately, I think also a common experience.
Okay. Yeah, I was thinking of our listeners who perhaps hadn't heard the term or had experience but not knowing what that was. Now, both of you have spoken a lot about mental health, and it's a big area, but specifically what did the studies find in terms of disability employment, and what areas of mental health did you look at?
I guess for me, mental health is absolutely critically important. That was the outcome of most of our studies, what we looked at. I do think it's important to acknowledge, though, what we actually mean by mental health, because I think sometimes in the disability space, especially when people who aren't really familiar with it, it can get a little bit mixed up. And so when we think about mental health, we think about how every person has the right to the highest possible standard of health, right? So this isn't just an absence of disease, but this is this total sense of physical, mental, social well-being. So mental health isn't just not having a mental illness or not having poor mental health, but it's the opposite. It's this sort of holistic state of well-being where people can cope with their normal life stressors, contribute to their community, and realize their abilities. So that's what we're aiming for when we talk about mental health in this context. Okay. And so we know that mental health is impacted by people's environments, and that includes the job and what their working environment looks like. So we overwhelmingly found that when people with disabilities had a job, it actually had positive effects on a sort of holistic measure of their mental health. So it wasn't just that not having a job was bad. It was actually having a job is good, and it's even better if that job is of good quality and, meets your needs for your working hours. So I think that's the real through line of our work, that employment was this key to actually having positive mental health outcomes.
I was just going to add a little bit to what Marissa said on why we think we're seeing those positive impacts of employment on mental health. And while our research didn't specifically look at how or why employment benefits mental health, we can use existing research to speculate about those reasons why we're seeing those associations. An obvious one that we might jump to straight away is financial security and that crucial role of employment in ensuring people do have financial security and income. One of our projects did look at the role of income and found that it only accounted for a small proportion of the beneficial effect on mental health. So there's a lot more going on than just the financial role of employment and income. I think from other studies, we could hypothesize that it's likely to bring social connectedness, which we know is really important for people with disability and their mental health. It's also likely to bring a sense of social identity, work identity, or a sense of collective purpose and self-esteem, which is really important for mental health. And it's also likely to bring time structure and stability to people's lives. So it's likely to be a combination of all of these factors which lead to those positive mental health impacts.
Definitely. There was a Harvard study done years and years ago, over decades, and this is about people without disabilities, that the key indicator of happiness and health and all of those sorts of things wasn't financial. It wasn't having a big bank account and all of those sorts of things that we normally associate with being or assume create happiness. It was actually about purpose and having a job you love. And excuse me if I'm misquoting the research or the article, but do you know the one I'm talking about? Am I making any sense to anybody?
Yes, absolutely. Makes sense. I can't reference the exact paper.
No, I can't cite it.
Absolutely. We talk about all the socioeconomic determinants, including psychosocial benefits, all these complex factors that interact together to lead to better mental health. And there are some models of the determinants of mental health. And when you start reading into it more, you realize how complicated it is. There are so many interrelated factors that lead to positive mental health. And sense of purpose is definitely important in those models. It's really hard to tease out one thing versus another because there's just so much complexity there.
Yeah, and I love that you recognise that it is complex and a holistic. It's not just a tick box, one size fits all thing. One of you mentioned taking a holistic approach much earlier in the podcast, and I think that's really important to recognise because it almost feels like some of the initiatives are currently being brought out for a bit of a tick box. We can find a solution for the short election term that's there, but longer term, we need to look at the broader social issues and much, much more that are affecting disability employment outcomes. And it's not just a case of an incentive or a plan or a scheme to maybe fix some things, but not looking at the bigger picture. So when it comes to employers and recruiters, are there any that you can think of who are really the gold standard in terms of this is what good employment looks like?
I can't think of a particular organization off the top of my head where I can go, that's absolutely the way to do it. And that may in part be a reflection on disability is very diverse and people have very different needs. So what may look like ideal sort of supports for one person might not be what another person needs. But I would say really broadly, employers, recruiters, they do have a good role to play in building inclusive workplaces. So they're in a position where they can make a difference, I would say. We know that discrimination is a really big barrier. And we also know that employers can start taking some steps to address that.
Okay. And what would some of those steps be?
So I think the first thing is thinking about creating inclusive environments broadly. And this kind of starts getting into a little bit around reasonable accommodations that you can offer to all your employees, not just people who say they have a disability, but also promoting this kind of visibly inclusive environment. And I realize that culture change doesn't happen overnight, but it's something for employers to start thinking about how they can signal that they actually not just tolerate diversity, but they actually value inclusivity.
Yeah.
So I think, they can actually encourage diverse groups of people to apply for jobs. You can have employee organizations in the workplace, thinking through your actual recruitment process. Are you maybe accidentally using some ableist language in your job ads? What have you thought about in terms of accessibility for interviews and just sort of thinking through those different steps of the process? And employers need support to do that. It's not necessarily a one and done situation, but I think by sort of carefully thinking through those steps, you can end up having more inclusive employment.
I was just going to add a nice place to start when you think about that is to look internally and reflect on how we do things within our own organisations. And we've worked very hard over the last few years to make our unit, our workplace in which we work, making it as flexible and accessible as possible. We always, when we have jobs coming up, we always encourage people with disabilities to apply and try to promote those employment opportunities within the disability community. So I think it's really, really important to lead the way you want to see other organisations do it and to promote those opportunities. I think alongside having those workplace inclusiveness, we need to think more broadly at a societal level. There are changes that have to happen in the workplace, but broader changes have to happen to promote a more inclusive society. We need to address community attitudes and try to understand how we can change community attitudes, as well as incorrect assumptions about people with disability. I think there's a lot of lack of awareness about the experience of disability, and this needs to shift. And one way this could be done is through better representation of people with disability.
Hooray!
For example, people with disability we know are rarely covered in the media, and when they are, it's often through negative stereotypes and not accurately represented. So I think better representation could challenge people's assumptions and start to understand broader, more diverse perspectives. And we need to make sure we champion the voices of people with disability in everyday life. And we try to do as much as possible of that in our research. And we know that leads to better quality and more relevant research.
Incredibly well said. Representation, definitely important. And a lot of the representation I see when it comes to disability employment is only those entry-level jobs, which are fine for some people, absolutely fantastic. And I certainly don't want to criticise that. But we need to see representation right across the board. There are CEOs, people in the C-suite, executives who also happen to have a disability, neurodivergence or chronic illness. We need to see that representation as well. So you did speak about all sorts of inclusive employment, and we know that's not just simple as sticking a real wheelchair ramp at the door and job done. But going right back to the start, the job ad and the employment process, how can we make that more inclusive if there is perhaps a recruiter out there going, I want to hire people with disabilities, but how do I start that conversation apart from writing people with disabilities, please apply at the top of my ad or something?
So I can't necessarily speak to this from, the specific research we did on how to actually change or modify the process. But I think based on what we've learned from doing research and employment among people with disability broadly, is that I would say as a first step, you need to start looking out for information from people with disabilities, making connections with maybe disabled people's organizations, taking a look at government websites, seeing what kind of services you could access to be able to hire and support people with disability, and just really sort of doing a bit of an information search so that you get some tools to help you feel disability confident, so that you're not just going into an employment process going, oh, I should hire someone with disabilities, but you actually go, okay, I feel like I have the tools and knowledge to actually support this person in the workplace. But I think in order to make sure you're doing that right, maybe as someone who doesn't have a great awareness of disability, it's just not something you've experienced in your life, actually speaking with people who do have that experience can be really illuminating and can help you understand maybe the kinds of choices you need to make or the kinds of things you need to think about. So I think that would be my first step in terms of going, oh, what do I do to make this better? There's people out there who can provide you with information to help you.
And I think alongside that, looking within the organisation and seeing if disabled voices can be championed within the organisation and diverse perspectives more generally, that might be more challenging in small businesses, but in large organisations, valuing that diversity explicitly and championing those voices could really help understand what some of those barriers are and how they could be addressed.
Yeah, definitely. And intersectionality as well, not just a bunch of white guys in wheelchairs, but the full gamut. Now, if we could sit you both down with key policy makers, decision makers, all the people who do all things for those of us with disability, what are some key messages, key findings from your research that you'd like to let them know about?
Well, what an opportunity that would be if we
Please invite me.
We would love to have you along. I think overwhelmingly, I would say that people with disability want to work, people with disability have a right to work, and that employment is a really key way to protect and promote the mental health of people with disability. I think those would really be my key messages in terms of this is something that's really important. It's not only what people want and have a right to do, but it's a way to improve their participation, make sure that they have better health outcomes and generally productive, flourishing lives. And we know that people want to work. We've heard that from our research from the disability community, but we also know that there are these real barriers to actually making that happen for people to gain and maintain employment. And so we really need policymakers to take a serious look at this. We need to actually live up to our responsibilities as part of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability and actually think about, okay, what we've been doing hasn't quite been working. What are some changes that we could make that would help people not just get a job, but actually keep it and flourish in it?
That's right. Look at the history. Historically, what we're doing is not working. So we need to start exploring different angles.
Some of the key messages that we'd really like to promote from our research is really a call to action, a set of recommendations for policymakers. There were 4 of them I'd like to highlight. Now, the first one we've already talked about, and it's the need to create inclusive workplaces. So I won't talk more about that. The second one is the need to build effective employment services to support people with disability, and particularly the need for individualised models of employment support. And I think this is really important to incorporate in the Disability Employment Services program, with a focus of placing people into jobs that meet their needs, their skills, their aspirations, not just getting people into any job. We know that there have been problems with the Disability Employment Services programs, but there are some major reforms going on. The new Inclusive Employment Australia program will be implemented later this year. And so we're hopeful that some of those barriers will be addressed and we'll have a system, a program that does support those individualised job placements. I think we also need to create more opportunities for people, more employment opportunities for people with disability, and that's not an easy problem to solve. I think it needs to be a multi-pronged approach to do that. We need lots of strategies, but some examples could be setting disability employment targets within workplaces or having hiring schemes specifically for people with disability, as well as financial incentives for employers to hire people with disability.
Okay. They're all right.
And then finally, my last one is we need to improve job preparedness for young people with disability. That's both within formal educational settings, but also outside formal educational settings for them to receive training and help them have the skills and experience to be ready to work. And we need to support positive expectations of employment from families and the community more broadly.
Getting back to that attitudinal thing that needs to shift and change, but it's, again, really great you take that holistic approach. It's not just about the workplace, but it's also systemic. What happens in education before the workplace and all of those sorts of things. The Disability Employment Program that you mentioned, July this year, is coming out. Could you tell me a little bit more about that, how it's supposed to combine NDIS and DES?
Look, there's a lot of uncertainty, I think, about what it will look like. One of the barriers that has been talked about is the lack of interface between different service systems, between the DES services, NDIS and health. So I'm hoping that will be addressed in the new program, but I don't have much clarity at the moment on what that will look like. But we are hopeful that we'll see improvements coming up in the next few months.
I hope so too. And what would you say to the argument that all of these programs, incentives, all of those things, they're great for a short time for some people, but they're really just not addressing the root cause of disability and unemployment, which is horrible social attitudes? Would either of you like to add to that? You touched on it a little bit before, Zoe, about it being much bigger than just disability employment, but even things like representation playing part.
Absolutely. I mean, all I can say is that these are really complex issues and they need to be addressed at multiple levels. Yes, there is broader reform that's needed, broader changes to attitudes more generally, but that doesn't mean that there also needs to be strong reforms within disability employment programs. So I think multiple strategies are needed. And one change that I know that is happening within the disability employment system is part-time work is one outcome that has changed. People don't necessarily need to be placed in full-time work. They can be placed in part-time work. That's showing us that the need for flexibility is being acknowledged. So these might seem like small changes, and I'm not aware of the rest of the changes that going alongside, but that was a finding of our research, and it's really great to see some of those findings being reflected in these new policies.
Zoe, you mentioned, I forget the exact words you used, but almost like quotas. That wasn't the word, but do you have any thoughts around disability quotas in employment?
It's a tricky one. I think it could work well within some organisations to demonstrate what inclusive workplaces look like. Ideally, we'd be in a situation where we don't need quotas.
Yeah, of course.
But I think quotas can be a way to get there. So I think there are targets within government organisations. I'm not too familiar with exactly what they are, and I don't think they're being met currently. So I need to look into that in a bit. But it'd be lovely to see some organisations that are doing it well and to really showcase how they're doing it and provide examples for other organisations to do the same.
Yeah, definitely. What are the barriers and challenges that you've found when it comes to disability employment?
The key barrier that we heard from in our research was discrimination. It was such an important theme that came up at every stage of the employment cycle. So I think it's really the key barrier that needs to be mentioned. But we did also find lots of other barriers. We found people experience challenges with employment services, a lack of focus on individualised employment models, and challenges getting a good job match through those employment services. We also found that people were telling us about a lack of jobs. So that really highlights the need to create employment opportunities. And people were also telling us about a lack of flexibility in the workplace, making it hard for people with disability to meet their needs. That may make jobs unsustainable in the long term for some people with disability. Then there are also much broader barriers to employment that are highlighted, and I might pass on to Marissa to talk more about that, but lots of broad social determinants that are relevant,
Sure.
Things like inadequate educational training or insecure housing.
That's exactly what I was going to say. We've got these barriers that are really distinct to employment, but then also there's so much more going on. People have complex lives. They bring their life experience with them when they're looking for work, when they're working in a job. And it's important to think through all these other determinants. They're determinants of health, but they also impact your ability to work. So like Zoe mentioned, housing. I know that's something you've discussed on the podcast before, and we know that that's really important, right? People need to have stable and secure housing. And if you don't have that, then gaining a job and maintaining that job is really, really difficult. Same thing if you don't have maybe the health services that you need to help you stay healthy and well and in a place where you're able to work, then maybe getting a job, that's going to be challenging, but potentially also not your biggest priority if you can't stay well yourself. So there's a lot of complex things going on that also feed into employment. And like Zoe said, this discrimination, that does feed in at all these different levels.
Absolutely. I think that's why we talk about the employment rate and why increasing that is so important, but it only tells a fraction of the story, because the disability employment rate, yeah, sure, we can get people in jobs, but that doesn't mean they're not going to be bullied or unable to access the office and get a cab, get public transport. And like you said, there are so many things that feed into disability unemployment. Now, we ask all of our guests this final question. What about your life or your research or anything you like is unexpected? Marissa, we'll start with you.
So I guess I would say you never quite know what opportunities might come your way. And actually ending up here having this lovely conversation with you and Zoe is definitely not what I expected in my life. I hadn't planned on this career path or even being in Australia. So I met my Australian partner when I lived in Taiwan and then moved here, made a career change because public health seemed like a rewarding space to be. And then, just never quite left the university, and I'm now here today. So I think it's all been a bit of an unexpected, but I would say very, very fun and very, very rewarding journey.
Glad to hear. Awesome. And what about you, Zoe?
Oh, it's funny. I have a very similar experience where I moved over to Australia from the UK for a 1-year contract and was determined to go back. And 14 years later, I'm very much established in Australia.
You're both stuck.
But my career journey has been unexpected, and I think research academic careers tend to be. There's a lot of insecurity in terms of funding, so you never quite know where it's going to go, which is terrifying and exciting. But as a result, I have a clear career plan B, because you never know what's going to happen. And my career plan B is to open a sourdough bakery.
Oh, God. And you're both in Melbourne, unfortunately, so unless you franchise and come up to Brisbane. But thank you both so much for being on the pod. What you're doing, research around disability employment, is absolutely fantastic. And the fact that you're including people with lived experience, disabled voices in that research, leading the research, all the things, is brilliant, because we didn't see that decades ago. So really, really excited that you're doing this, and hopefully it can inform some groundbreaking policy that changes things and finally starts moving the situation from where it is. Because like you both alluded to, the stats around disability employment, despite all the government interventions and money that was thrown at it, hasn't changed. So we need to look at something different. And this sort of research can really help decision makers to adjust what they're doing. So thank you again, both of you, for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks for listening to That Was Unexpected. If you liked what you heard and you want to hear more, then hit subscribe wherever you get your fix. Have any questions or topics that you'd love for us to tackle? Great! Email podcast@youngcare.com.au. We can't wait to hear from you. Check out our show notes for transcripts, video recordings, and to find out more about our guests, plus the useful resources they share. You can reach us on Facebook, Instagram, X, and LinkedIn at YoungCareOz. Let's not forget, an inclusive community is everyone's business. So let's keep working together to break down barriers and smash some stereotypes.